So we're going to talk about multi-site today. I'm not going to get too detailed into anything, but I'm going to try to, I think the goal is to make anybody who's afraid of multi-site less afraid of multi-site, because I really don't think it's that much more difficult than WordPress itself. So there's a few key things that once you know that, multi-site becomes a lot easier to work with, or at least makes a little bit more sense so you can still be confused. So going along with what Helen said earlier, I think knowing your code and knowing core and kind of having that curiosity to dig further helps a lot when trying to learn something. So that's basically what I did for this, and basically the only reason that I'm in the multi-site world entirely. I don't have power connected. So the big part for me about really understanding multi-site is first walking through the history of things and trying to figure out how we got to where we are and why the code base is, well, such a mess. But you can trace multi-site all the way back to the beginning. So we know that WordPress is a fork of B2. B2 was created back in 2001. It was around for a couple of years before development kind of stalled a little bit. In 2003, WordPress was forked off of B2. There were also two other forks. There was B2 Smarty and B2 Evolution. B2 Smarty was created by Donica O'Keefe, and that actually became B2++ fairly quickly. That added Smarty caching to B2 because he didn't like the way that the themes were done, and then added the ability to have multiple blogs. So for his Linux users group in Ireland, blogs.linux.ie, he was able to use B2 to power this huge community. So when Matt finally announced the first version of WordPress in May of 2003, he also reached out to Donica and asked him to kind of join forces and to try to merge the projects together. So soon after, that became WordPress multi-user, and it basically was the same thing, which is WordPress instead of B2, but on top of that, additional tables for additional blogs, and then Smarty caching or Smarty templates and Smarty caching for a long time. So it was, I think, 2 years later after that, Donica got hired by Matt at Automatic to start working on WordPress.com. At that point, WordPress multi-user became kind of affectionately known as WordPress Mu or WordPress MU. Became more of a public project. Started to gain a few contributors, but it was really like a WordPress.com project with the goal of launching this service so people could sign up for sites. So in August of 2005, there was a beta release. November 2005, WordPress.com launched. And then for the next few years after that, it really started to take off. More and more people contributed to the project. And WordPress multi-user kind of got to be its own kind of big thing in general. It's the wrong adapter. So 3 years after that, May of 2009, I think, Matt announces to WordCamp San Francisco that we're going to be merging WordPress MU and WordPress together. The community kind of is surprised by it. I think a few core developers were surprised by it. And then later that year, the tickets finally opened, 11644, I think. It's this huge ticket. It spawned 100 other tickets and tons of commits. And so it's a 6-month effort, but multi-site was merged into WordPress. So WordPress 3.0 launched in June of 2010. It's WordPress 3.0 Thelonious, after Thelonious Monk. Michael Pick does the video, and the tagline at the end is, use it to power one site or 10 million straight no chaser. And I think straight no chaser is a perfect tagline for multi-site itself. It's that noise. All right. So you have your history. I think that it provides some context for kind of how the code got there. So it got there as this blogging platform where people can come and sign up for blogs. And it's kind of the thing that the community worked on. And then now, over the years, it's become used for more and more things. And so we're starting to get away from that kind of big blogging platform. So we're going to walk through some structure, kind of how WordPress figures out what to load when a page is requested, some awareness, the things that you can use to kind of take advantage of that structure and how you can hop around and use things easier, and then a few things that make it easier to extend multi-site. So every WordPress installation starts off with these tables. So you have your options, your posts, your comments, your terms, your users. The second that you install a network to create a multi-site instance, you get a new set of tables. The blogs table, the signups table, the site table, site meta. And then the users table and those tables kind of become this global group. So they no longer belong to that first site that you set up. They belong to the network that you created. And then every site after that you add, we add a new set of tables for the options, the posts, the comments, the terms. And it goes and goes and goes and goes. And if you're working on something like WordPress.com, this looks insane and you wouldn't even be able to read it on here. So the job of multi-site really becomes, when a site is requested, which set of tables do I use? And that's basically all that multi-site is which set of tables do I use? It lets me use one code base, one user's base, and kind of one just core set of things to help distribute requests out to this big world of tables. And there's a couple things that help us keep track of that, and they're badly named. So there's the network global, which is current site, and it tells you which network you are currently loading. That's populated with some information from the database. There's an ID that correlates to the WP site ID, the domain, the path, and then the blog ID, which correlates with the ID from the blog in WP blogs. That is this network's main blog. Then we also have the site, which is not current site, but current blog. And it has a similar information, so it's got the ID of the site from the blogs table, its parent network as the site ID, the domain, and the path. So you always have these objects available to you so you can figure out which site has loaded. And then in WordPress 3.9, we introduced a couple functions that make it easier to populate these a little bit. So get site by path, takes the domain, takes the path, looks up in the database, finds the right site, and then kind of fills that into the current, well, returns it as a site object for current blog that you can then use. Get network by path does the same thing, but for networks. So same thing, a network, a path. We look it up in the sites table. We return something that can populate current site. So then all the heavy work actually gets done inside mssettings.php. And if you look at this and compare it to one of the first change sets from WordPress MU back in 2009 or 2010, many parts are exactly the same. We've been working hard to try to get things better, but it can be understood pretty quickly. So you look at this, and when a request comes in, we immediately try to figure out what the domain is and what the path is. And then we're going to take those two pieces of information and try to figure out what the current site is, or the network, and what the current blog is, the site. By default, when you install multi-sites, you're given these set of constants that you can use. And this kind of takes a lot of the guesswork away. So you get domain current site, path current site ID current site, blog ID current site. And if you provide these to WordPress through your WP config, then we can immediately just define that network global by filling in all the information. And then the only thing we need to do after that is look up the associated blog or site. If you don't use these, the subdirectory and subdomain configurations become a lot more important. So in a subdirectory configuration, you have the same domain for all of the sites on your networks, and then all of the paths differ. So what we want to do when a page loads there, to be more efficient, is populate the network object first. So we determine which network we're on by looking up the domain and the path. And then once we know that information, we can look up the site that we're on to populate the current blog. So current sites, if there's really only one network, we're able to just guess at that immediately and fill the object. If there's not, then we use get network by path. And then the current blog, we'll use get site by path right after. Subdomain configuration, skip that. So sites on the network have different subdomains, and they can actually have different paths. So I think the secret meaning of subdomain now is you can kind of have these arbitrary domains and paths. There's not really a UI for it in core, but we can support pretty much anything. To do this, we populate the site object first before the network object. So we use get site by path, fill in the current blog object, and then from there we get the site ID or the network that blog is associated with, and we can fill in the rest of the data pretty easily. So then once you have all that information, you go back to the set of tables, and you tell WordPress you're using, the the site ID 6. So you're going to WP_6_ options to get your options and your posts and your terms and all of that stuff. Kind of the side thing that doesn't really fit with the tables is it hidden in the WP user meta table are all the capabilities that you have for different sites on the network. And that prefix works the same way. So if it's site ID 6, then you look in the WP user meta table, and a user has a meta key of WP_6_ capabilities, and that's what says what their role on that site is on. So once you know the structure, it gets pretty easy to start to extend that or start to comprehend how to extend that. So now your job is basically figuring out where you are, what sites you're on, and then how you can jump around between different sites and maybe grab data or share things or do specific things for specific sites or networks. And there's some stuff we can do. So back in MS settings, above the kind of code area I showed you before, is the first kind of load of multi-site. So the first thing we do is bring in MS load. We bring in the default constants, get everything kind of set up for you. And then if sunrise is defined, we load this little magical file called sunrise.php, where you can basically do anything that you want to short circuit the process of finding that network and that site. Because a little farther down here, before we do all of that, is this a subdomain, subdirectory, or is anything else defined? We check to see if that network object and that site object are already defined. If they are, we skip all of that and just go straight to setting the prefixes. So you can use whatever logic you want to in that sunrise to determine what your network is, determine what your site is, to do anything you need to kind of skip it. So as a kind of a small example of what we do at WSU, we go out of our way kind of to cache these lookups. So we almost do it the same way as core. This was written before 3.9, so I think we can probably make some adjustments to make it easier. But we grab the domain, we grab the URI, we set up these global cache groups so that when we find the current blog object, we can cache it. So the next time, or for the next 12 hours, I think, we don't have to hit the database at all. We just know what the network is, we know what the site is, and we go. As an example of extra stuff you can do, we keep track of which domains do not support HTTPS yet. So there'll be a brief period when we add a domain where we need to request a cert, and then it might be like 4 or 6 hours where somebody has to do some workflow to complete this, but we don't want to necessarily prevent somebody from starting to work on the site if they can kind of have a less risky connection, like if they're on a hardwired connection and don't have to worry about anybody hacking. But then we use that, we add that to the current blog object to see if SSL or TLS is enabled, and then use that to define the constants when necessary, because really you only want people logging into the admin if it's HTTPS only. So once you've determined the structure, you've loaded up WordPress, and now you're in a regular plugin or a regular theme or something, and you want to start bouncing around within your network to try to get additional data. Switch to blog can come in really handy. And what that does is you look up some kind of site ID, and you pass it to this, and it adjusts the entire context of WordPress to be using that site instead. So it changes the global blog ID, the database table prefix, the cache group, the user capabilities. So all of a sudden on that chart of databases or database tables, you're using an entirely different chunk, even though you've loaded all the code and you're kind of displaying the site that was requested originally. It doesn't switch any plugin or theme code because that kind of core PHP has already been loaded, and there's not really a great way to switch over and then sandbox a new instance that loads up all the plugins. So if you really need to have shared functionality, you do need to do kind of due diligence and make sure that a plugin's activated on multiple sites. And then once you've switched, you might pull posts from the main sites or a nav menu from another site, or kind of anything that you want to. You can get back by using restore current blog, which maintains this global WP switch stack object, or global, that basically keeps track of this stack of how many times you've used switch to blog and then lets you reverse back through the process. So if you get really confused, you can just loop through that while it's equaling true, and then once it returns false, then you can bail out and know that you're back to normal. And this is, so a lot of people will come up and ask, like, I want shared media on my site, or I want a shared navigation across my network, or I want to do, any kind of thing, and they're trying to come up with these crazy solutions, and a lot of times my answer is just create an additional site where you want to have that data, and then just use switch to blog to go over and get it, because it makes it a lot easier. Some code you only want to run on is main site. So if it's the main site on the network, you might have a different navigation than another site. And this really just checks to see if the current network's object's main blog ID matches the current site that you're on. And the same thing exists for is main network. It doesn't get used too often because there's not a UI for multiple networks yet, but if you do have multiple networks, it's pretty easy to determine if you're on that main one or not. And at any time, you can use get blog details or get current site without arguments to get back kind of just a copy of that object, that current blog or current site object of what you're working on. And you can use get blog details to get information on other sites. So if you need to look up what blog ID, wsu.edu is, you can use get blog details to go find that information, and then use switch to blog to go switch over to it and then pull whatever posts you want and move on. So extension, there's a few different ways, a few different things that are, I think, common tasks. There's plenty of plugins out there to do all of the various things we've all run into when trying to work with multi-site. There's a few key ones that I think a lot of people just end up needing. First of all, this isn't a single plugin, but there's an MU plugins directory that's used in single site and in multi-site, but becomes super useful because you can put in all of your filters that you want to have always available globally, always available network-wide, without having to worry if the plugin's activated on a network or activated on a single site, or if it can be activated or if it can be deactivated. If you put a file here and it's in PHP, it's going to run on every page load, and that can just be very useful as a network administrator. Domain mapping is a big one. So that concept, as I understand it, is, I don't use it too much, but like the WordPress.com model, if I was to set up jeremyfelt.com on WordPress.com and wanted to log into my admin, I would probably go to jeremyfelt.wordpress.com. So WordPress.com would understand that I exist at this address for the admin, jeremyfelt.wordpress.com, and everybody on the outside needs to map that domain to the other. So over the years, there was MU domain mapping was the big one. They kind of did this, has done this, still does this. It's still a perfectly good plugin, but I think the main part about that is it has all of the code that supports WordPress all the way back through 3.0. So there's a lot of just old cruft that we don't need anymore. Ryan McHugh's done a good job with Mercator and under the human-made repository, and that's kind of, I haven't used it too much yet, but kind of taking over for kind of the modern practice of how to map domains, and in this case, aliases of a domain to a single one. And they use it in production on happytables.com. WP Multi-Network is one that I don't think it's actually been updated in a couple years, but it still works perfectly except for, I think, one PHP notice about a deprecated like escape. But it provides the UI for generating multiple networks. So WordPress by default supports multiple networks as long as you can add them to the database. It doesn't provide a UI for it. But this gives you a simple screen where you can type in the network name, the domain, the path, the site, and it just goes for you. After that, you're kind of on your own and how you manage the sites and capabilities and things, but it provides that nice UI to get started. HyperDB, once you start to scale WordPress multi-site, can be a good one. What this does is kind of acts as a way to shard out all of your data. So, I mean, once you have hundreds or thousands of database tables, you can set up multiple database servers and then tell HyperDB if the request for this set of tables comes in, I want it to go over to the database server that's located in Austin. And if this one comes in, go over here. And this one should be write-only, these three should be read-only. And it can kind of manage that traffic for you to help you spread out more horizontally while still maintaining that single code base. And then in general, just object caching as a whole, I think, is a good thing. It's really easy to get started with multi-site, and then as you start adding sites, you get to 10, everything's working fine, 100, everything's working fine, but then things will start to churn really quickly if you don't have any kind of caching enabled. It becomes a lot easier to create the sites than to maintain them. But if you look into Memcached or Redis or anything like that and kind of do a proper object cache, it's pretty amazing how far you can stretch a single server and how many sites you can host. If you install a plugin like Query Monitor and look at a front end or a back end page view in WordPress, before object caching, you'll see the hundreds of queries that are run to do who knows what. And then as soon as you enable that, it goes down to 10 or 15 queries, and you're living in a pretty great world. So yeah, I would recommend Memcache over a WP Super Cache or W3 Total Cache once you get to scaling this kind of thing, just because it's easier to manage. In the future, we're working hard on the future. It's a messy world. But there's a few key initiatives that we're going through right now. The 4.3 cycle just started, and we're taking a big look at network admin UI, trying to see if we can improve kind of just how it looks and feels. I think if you tried to add a new site on that phone, I don't even know what would happen right now. We'd like to add classes for WP Site, WP Network, WP Site Query, WP Network Query. So some of this stuff becomes a lot easier to extend, and some of the terminology makes more sense. And kind of just, follows the way that WordPress is just getting better at our organization of code. And then we've had a lot of good conversation around types of networks and kind of how to get away from the world that WordPress MU created originally, which is the open registration, sign up for blogs anonymously and have everything going. And also support a lot of the business use cases that happen, like for a university, where we have many different networks, and it's very trusted professors or students or who knows what. So we've had some good talks, some confusing talks and good talks about trying to create a system where when you install a network in multi-site, you can either choose from a series of options or 2 options or 3 options to kind of define the network that you want to create as you get set up, so we can disable some of the stuff you don't need and then make sure some of the stuff you do need really does work. So we're always looking for input on that. We have office hours in the core multi-site channel on Slack every Tuesday at 8 o'clock p.m. UTC. And then, we're in there all the time lurking around. So if you're at all interested in contributing to WordPress and you want to get started by contributing to multi-site, we'd be happy to have you. My slides are at jeremyfelt.com/loopconf. Don't forget the extra slash because I broke my rewrite rule. And ask me any questions you want on Twitter. And I'm going to go hang out in the back there in the other room, and feel free to just pull me aside at any time over the next couple days and ask any of your crazy multi-site questions that you'd like answered.